Bye. Hey, my name's Curtis. I'm our Twinsburg, Macedonia campus minister. It's good to be here hanging out with you guys. If you're hanging out with us online at mochurch.tv, thanks for being here, for signing in. We are going to continue on in our series, Bad Boys of Easter. So go ahead and grab your Bibles and open up to Luke 23. If you don't have a Bible that you feel like you could read and understand, there's some paperback ones at the ends of the rows. Grab those suckers, pass them down, and we're going to be on page 858. Luke 23 actually starts on page 857, but we're going to start in verse 32, so go to page 858. All right, now, by round of applause, how many of you have turn-by-turn directions on your phone? Anybody? Okay. Yeah, so the addition of turn-by-turn directions on your phone has been a godsend. It's really kind of changed the way that we have gotten, that we get directions. You know, it's right now, with the turn-by-turn directions, you don't even need the address of where you're hoping to get to, because you could, in most cases, you can just go onto your phone, go into your maps, type in Chipotle Mexican Grill, because let's be honest, that's where we all want to be right now anyway, and it would give you the closest Chipotle to you. You can press go, and then it will give you turn-by-turn directions to get there. And if you make a wrong turn while en route, what will it do? Rerouting, you know, it'll redirect you. It'll give you the directions, and then you can just keep going. Now, before the craze of turn-by-turn directions on your phone, the thing that came just before that was this thing called MapQuest. By round of applause, how many of you can remember MapQuest? Yes. Now, if you remember MapQuest, the hard part about MapQuest was the directions that it gave you never really completely matched like the beginning, you know? And so we had a nickname for it. MapQuest was actually more accurately called CrapQuest. Yes. And so with MapQuest, you had to have the location of where you wanted to go. You had to have the address. And so you would go in, you would type in your point A, which would usually be your starting home address, and then your point B. And then you'd click Get Me Directions. And then it would give you turn-by-turn directions that then you could print out, and you'd have to staple them because it would usually, you know, be like this long. And it would give you like a map along with each one. It was terrible. And when you would start out your trip, it almost always required you to make a gut call based on a feeling, right? Because the road names would never completely match up to the road signs that you would see. And so based on like the map that they would give you and everything, like you would have to kind of make a call. I'm pretty sure we're supposed to go in this direction. And the hard part about MapQuest was if you made a wrong turn, it didn't tell you. You would like figure it out either too late, and then once you figured out you made a wrong turn, it was kind of up to you to then figure out how to correct your mistake. And it would turn road trips awful sometimes. I'll give you an example. My sophomore year of college, I had a roommate. His name was Scott. And Scott was friends with a rock band called I Am Ghost. And we went to school in Johnson City, Tennessee, and I Am Ghost was coming to North Carolina to play a concert. It was about 6 hours away. So Scott invited me and our other two roommates that, you know, shared this room together. And he invited us all to go with him to this concert Saturday night in North Carolina. And the three of us were like, yes, absolutely, we'd love to go. But we're not leaving until after an intramural game on Saturday morning. We had our priorities very clear. You know, like you got to win those intramural games. And this intramural flag football game was actually the students versus alumni yearly football game. And it had been going on for like 20 plus years, and the students had never won. And we were like, this year it's going to be different. Now, we knew that to travel the 6 hours to North Carolina, we were already kind of pressing the travel time that it was going to take in order to get to the concert on time. So Saturday comes, we go and we play the game, and guess what? That year it was different. The students won, yeah, for the first time ever. The problem was the game went into overtime. And so we were already pressing travel time like when the game was supposed to end, and it ends in overtime, and so we are late at this point in time. We come back into the dorm room, and because Scott did not play, and we were like, hey, Scott, we won. And he goes, shut up and get in the car, kind of just like that. And so we go out to the car, and my two other buddies, they force me to sit up front and be the navigator. They hand me the CrapQuest directions, and they sit in the back of the car, and nobody says anything on the road trip. Normally, when you go see a band in concert, what do? You play that band's music and kind of like rock out on the way, like getting pumped for the concert. Nobody said anything. Scott didn't put any music on. We just sat there in silence and listened to his engine rev as he raced down the highway. And to make matters worse, he got rear-ended earlier that week, and he put his bumper back on with duct tape. And so while we're flying down the highway, all we're listening to is me occasionally giving CrapQuest directions and the bumper going down the highway. Nobody saying anything. It's painfully silent because Scott is so angry that we're late, rightfully so. And at the very beginning of the trip, I had to make a call based on the CrapQuest directions. I think this is the right way to go. And so I tell Scott to go. And we're traveling, and we're going. And that good feeling all of a sudden begins to get worse and worse and worse. Until all of a sudden I see that we passed a highway, and because of the map that it gave me, I recognized, oh no, we're not on the right road. We're not even headed in the right direction. And we've been going for like 40 minutes. And so then I proceeded to do what all of you would do, right? I begin to have an internal debate with myself about whether or not I tell him or just let him keep going, and when he figures it out, say, oh, I had no idea. And so I went back and forth, and then eventually I decided, no, I got to tell him. So I told him, Scott, we're headed in the wrong direction. We're what? He whips around, and eventually we get headed in the right direction. And good news, we made it. We made it there just in time to see his band go on stage. So we still made it. That is an indictment on how fast he drove at that point in time. But we did make it, and we did eventually get there. Now, here's the thing. I really thought when we started off and I was following those directions, I really thought that we were headed in the right direction, right? I really thought that was the right way to go. I had a good feeling about it, but then all of a sudden when that feeling got bad, it was like, okay, what do I do now? And maybe it's not been with direction, right? But there's been other times where we have experienced that same sort of feeling. Have you ever made a decision and you really thought it was the right decision, but then as you begin to live in your decision and other things begin to play out, you realize oh no, that was not the right call. And then you're faced with the decision, what are you going to do? Will you admit that you're wrong and try and correct it, or do you just pile it on because it's like, I'm already here. I might as well just live this one out, I might as well just make this worse. And see, here's the thing. I realized kind of as we were going, I realized, man, all is not what it seems. Because I really thought, based on the evidence that I had, based on the beginning of the directions, I really thought that I had us headed in the right direction. But eventually I saw something that made me realize, man, all is not what it seems. And so then it was faced with, do I correct now, even though I'm so terribly late? Even though it's late, I realized that all is not what I thought it was. All is not what it seemed. And so today I want to talk to you about another relationship that I think where we have to take a look at, and we can see from our bad boy that we're talking about this morning, that all is not what it seems in this relationship. And the relationship that I want to talk to you about is the relationship between life and God. Right, and so here's what we tend to do, because I think we tend to kind of confuse and conflict these two relationships. Because see, often the way we look at things is like when life is good, God is good. Right? But then when life is bad, we tend to say, well, then that God is bad. To state it more explicitly, when someone is experiencing extreme disappointment in life, it's easy to assume that there is no good God, or perhaps that there is no God at all. You see, it is very easy for disappointment with life to accidentally become disappointment with God. Right? In some cases, we could remove that word accidentally. Right? It's very easy for disappointment with life to become disappointment with God. Because we tend to think when life is good, God is good. When life is bad, God must be bad. Right? When your dreams don't come true. Right? When you're praying that prayer and that prayer just won't get answered the way that you want it to be. When you just can't seem to catch a break. right? When your family is just able to move on, but you're still stuck there when everyone else, like with everyone else, you sit around and you look and it seems like, man, for everyone else, it just seems like it always works out, but it doesn't for me. And then what makes this so complicated is if you were taught in an all-powerful personal God like I was growing up, it's really difficult. In fact, maybe it's impossible for us to not take our disappointments in life and then pour them out and blame them on God. I mean, let's be honest, it only seems to make sense. And so today we're going to look at a story. And one of the things I want to remind you of before we jump into today's story is oftentimes we will read stories in the Bible and we will just kind of move on for them, and we forget that these were people who had stories of their own before they became part of the bigger story that's told in the Bible, where they experienced life. And I believe the guy that we're looking at today had an experience with life kind of like this. Right? Life has not gone well for this man. It at least has not gone how he originally planned for it to go. You see, when we meet our guy that we're talking about today, the thief, the criminal on the cross, when we meet him, he's been kept in a hole in the ground for probably some time, a pretty good length of time. He's been condemned to death. He is so violent and he is so unpredictable. He has become so unpredictable that his only value left in life is to demonstrate the futility of defying the Roman government. He's so violent and he's so unpredictable, he can't even be trusted as a slave. He can't even be trusted to row a Roman galley. They are going to crucify him and use him to make an example to him and to others that no one should defy the Roman government. Now Luke, the story of Luke, the book of Luke in our Bible, that tells us how this story is worked out. And this is not a Bible story. I cannot stress this enough. This is more than a Bible story, a story that's in our Bible. I would say that this isn't once upon a time, right? I would say that this isn't even a religious story. This is something that happened. It's an event that happened that was written down by someone who said at the very beginning of his writing that he went through great lengths to research and talk to eyewitnesses, people who were there, heard, saw what happened, and then wrote it down to give us a chronological account of Jesus' life. Look, he says this, Luke, in verses 3 through 4, he says, with this in mind, okay, as he's opening this book, opening this account of Jesus' life that we're going to read this morning, he says this, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything, I talked to these people. Since I investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So that why? So that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. And Luke's account, that becomes the book of Luke in our Bibles, it was so well done. It was so well done, the chronological account and the research that was put into it. It was so well done that people began to meticulously copy it because people wanted to know the events that happened in Jesus' life, how it all played out. And over time, this gospel, this book of Luke, the good news of Jesus, the book of Luke was gathered together with other accounts of Jesus' life. And about 200 years later, they were all taken together and bound up in a book that we now call the Bible. But before there was the Bible, before there was a church, before there was momentum, it says that the writer Luke took great pains to research and write down carefully what he found by talking to the people who saw, touched, and heard face to face from Jesus to find out exactly what happened that day that Jesus was crucified. And here's what Luke found happened to Jesus on that day. Verse 32, it says that two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him, with Jesus, to be executed. And when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. It says that two other men were led out to be executed, one on his right and one on his left. Now, when we're reading the story of Jesus, When you sit down and we start reading the story of Jesus, when you sit down and you start reading your Bible, maybe in the wee hours of the morning or late hours of night or maybe on your lunch break, when we sit down and we start reading the story of Jesus, it is so easy. It is so easy to come to these sentences, right, and read this and to just move on. But there is so much that is packed in this one little word right there. There's so much agony. There's so much pain. There's so much suffering, right? Part of the root where we get this word crucified from is the word suffocation. Because when someone was hung on a cross, they essentially suffocated to death. And so there's so much time. In some cases, it was hours and hours and hours. In some cases, 2 to 3 days for someone to die by crucifixion. And so there's so much agony, so much pain, so much resentment, so much suffering, so much embarrassment packed in this one little word. As a story, as we read, as all of this plays out. And what we find out is that the Romans did not invent crucifixions, but the Romans did perfect it. And people came out in droves to see when someone would be hung on a cross, to see someone crucified. And so as all of this continues, right? So as Jesus is crucified, as these hours upon hours and hours of Jesus suffocating to death, as the crucifixion is happening, we get a little insight into a conversation that Jesus has. And as these rulers, as people are there insulting him, and we've got a thief on his right and a thief on his left, Jesus prays something in the middle of all of this. He utters a word that had probably never been uttered from a cross before. It says this in verse 34, Jesus begins to pray, and he begins his prayer with Father. Now, when men are suffering, and men are in pain, and they're in agony, men do not cry out for their fathers. Men cry out for their mothers. And yet, as Jesus is hanging on the cross, got a criminal on his right and a criminal on his left, they overhear a prayer that Jesus begins to pray to his God, and he begins with Father, addressing God as Father. In the middle of his pain and his agony, Jesus cries out, Father. Now, if that word caught them by surprise, if that word was probably never uttered from a cross before, the next thing Jesus said was almost certainly never uttered from a cross before. And the criminals overhear this prayer, and Jesus prays, Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. See, there's people all around. People come out in droves in order to see a crucifixion. And the Roman soldiers actually gathered up Jesus' belongings, the few belongings that he has. And then right there in front of Jesus, they begin essentially playing a gambling game to see who's going to get to go home with a relic of the Jewish king, of Jesus. Right there in front of them, all this is playing. Insults are being hurled all over this place. And two men are dying on his right and on his left. And all of Jesus' enemies are celebrating the end of Jesus on the cross. And in the middle of that awful scene, Jesus prays, Father, forgive them. He cries out to God in the middle of his suffering. And then Luke, who says, I thoroughly investigated all of these things in order to give to you an accurate account of what happened. Luke, who investigated all these things, he goes on to say in verse 35, the people stood watching. Right? People came out in droves in order to see a crucifixion. Everybody, in fact, they probably lined the city walls in order to look out on the hillside and see as this crucifixion happened. And there's something about that we can relate to. We don't have to think very hard to believe that this is true, because there's something embarrassingly fascinating about suffering, isn't there? Like, I think back to, like, when I was in middle school and high school and the fight breaks out, and someone's getting the snot kicked out of them, and people just gather around because everyone wants a front row seat to see the agony. And so it says the people stood there watching. People came out in droves in order to see the suffering that was happening with Jesus. And then it goes on. Luke says, the people stood watching, and the rulers, they even sneered at him, at Jesus. They said, he saved others. Let him save himself. If he's God's Messiah, the chosen one. Can you hear like the sarcasm, like dripping from that? It says the people stood watching, and it says the rulers were insulting him. The very people who had Jesus arrested. These were the people, these were the religious leaders that had the most to lose from Jesus' success. This was the group of people that was constantly put to shame by Jesus' answers to their questions. And now, with Jesus hanging on the cross, right, there would be no more shame. There would be no more humiliating answers to their gotcha questions. You no longer have to fear because of the crowds, because there was going to be no more Jesus. And this was their moment with Jesus hanging on the cross to take the 2.5 years where Jesus has got them with his answers to their questions and take all of their anger and all of their frustration and all their humiliation and pour it back out on Jesus. And if that's not enough, Luke tells us that there was another group of people who wanted to get in on the action. We have the people who stood watching, we got the rulers who sneered at him, and then it says the soldiers. Luke says the soldiers also came up and they mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar, which was essentially their cheap military wine. So they offered him wine vinegar, and they said, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. Notice a theme with how they're making fun of Jesus. If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. Now, when we go and we see movies or you see pictures and paintings of someone who was crucified, typically the way that the picture is painted or the way that the video is shown is that the person was crucified with their feet somewhere between like 2, 3, maybe 4 feet off the ground, so that when they're up on the cross, they're really high and everyone can see them. Now, that's not typically how crucifixion was done. Because, see, the whole point behind crucifixion, besides the suffering for the person on the cross, the whole point of crucifixion next to suffering was humiliation. And so typically, a person was crucified with their feet maybe 6 inches off the ground. And the idea was, and the reason why that was, so that they stood up on the cross so that passerbys could come by and they could get right in the person's face. And they could yell and hurl their insults and spit on their face and then turn around and walk away. So they could almost be eye to eye with the person hanging there on the cross. And as if all of that's not enough, right? You got the people who stood watching. You've got the rulers who came out there and they had their fair share of fun to make of Jesus. The soldiers doing their thing. As if all of that's not enough, there's one more group of people that want to get in on the action. You see, we find out that up until this point in time, the 2 criminals, they wanted to die the same way that they had lived, and that was defiantly. And they had been shouting their insults and come get me, and all that stuff at the crowd. And then for some reason, maybe it was just Jesus' passivity that just was too much for them. They took their agony, they took their anger, and they stopped insulting the crowd, the 2 criminals, and they turned their anger and their insults in towards Jesus. Matthew 27, verse 44, another account of this story, says, in the same way, the rebels, the criminals, the thieves who were crucified with him also heaped insults on Jesus. And so now everybody around is insulting Jesus. And then something happens. Something different happens. Yeah. He's like, yeah. Something happens, and one of the rebels, one of the criminals, senses something different about Jesus. In Luke 23, verse 39, one of the insults that was said of the criminal, of Jesus was this. One of the criminals turned to Jesus, who hung there, and one of the insults was, aren't you the Messiah? Aren't you God? How familiar does that question sound? Now, maybe we haven't asked it quite like that. But I've asked a question that sounds more like this. God, why don't you stop this? God, why don't you show up? God, aren't you supposed to be able to do something, Mr. All-Powerful God? It's the same question that the criminal asks on the cross. Aren't you the Messiah? Why don't you stop this, God? If you were the Messiah, this would not be happening to you. If you were an all-powerful God, this would not be happening to you. And if you were a good all-powerful God, this certainly would not be happening to us. Save yourself and us. Aren't you the Messiah? But you're not the Christ. You're not God. You can't save yourself, and you certainly can't save us. And then for some reason, one of the criminals recognizes that there's something different. Suddenly, in the midst of all the pain, of all the insults, of all the noise, one criminal, our guy that we're talking about today, he stops his insults and he talks back to the criminal. And he realizes, I think in this moment, that all is not as it seems. He senses something strangely selfish about Jesus. And you can almost imagine with me as these events begin to play out in his head, think with me perhaps how the criminal thought as he's hanging on the cross. Father? Who would cry out to Father at a time like this? In fact, Father, forgive them? Who on earth could pray, Father, forgive them in the middle of suffering like this? And then I think it clicks with him. Oh my God. The Messiah. We almost miss it. And so our criminal speaks up and says to the other criminal, but the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. And the criminal realizes, since we are under the same sentence, wait. He's saying, I think I see something. I think I see something different about this man. Here is this man who is in the middle, is suffering in the same manner that we are. Life is kicking him in the teeth. And yet, he has not abandoned his faith in God. He must be a righteous man. I mean, who else in a moment like this would pray and address God as Father and ask his God to forgive them? He is suffering unjustly, and he still believes that God can be called Father and that God can be trusted. You see, I think the lesson that our thief gets in this moment is that this man has not drawn conclusions about God based on the way that life and others have treated him. You see, suddenly for our criminal, and it took me a little while to see this, but now I can't see anything else in this story. Because look what it goes on in the rest of verse 41 where the criminal says, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. And if you would be willing to, and if you could put yourself in the scenario with me, you can almost feel the wheels of the criminal's mind begin to turn as he thinks through all this. And suddenly, he is beginning to see Jesus the way no one else in the crowd is seeing him. And the criminal's thought process goes something like this. If an innocent man who suffers like a guilty man can maintain faith in God, then how much more a guilty man for whom there is some justification for his suffering? And it dawns on him, this man is the Son of God. And he may be way late, but he realizes all is not as it seems. He realizes he's headed in the wrong direction. And what does he do? He says this, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, because I see it. I get it now. Not because of anything that I've done. In fact, it's really in spite of what I've done. Because Jesus, if you can maintain faith in God in these circumstances when life is difficult and you don't deserve it, then perhaps there is a good and faithful God after all. And get this, I love this. This might be, I think, the most poetic thing about Jesus' life. People put so much emphasis on last words. And think about this for a second. The very last conversation that Jesus has on earth before he dies is not with a ruler. It's not with some powerful man. It's not with some wealthy person who could plaster Jesus' story all over the known world at the time. It's not even a conversation with a righteous person. The very last conversation that Jesus has on earth before he dies is with one of the most vile and wretched human beings in the known world at the time. And he asks Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replies, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." In spite of all you've done, not because you've rededicated your life here on the cross. Rededicating your life from a cross is meaningless. There is no from now on when you are within minutes of dying. There is no "I promise I will," right? What if the lesson we are supposed to learn from this story is the same one that the thief realizes in his final moments, and that is that the evil and suffering we experience in life is not reflective of God's thoughts about us. The evil and suffering that we experience in life is not reflective of God's thoughts about you. The things that you are suffering through, the evil that someone is doing to you is not reflective of what God thinks about you. This is the last message before Jesus dies. And then Jesus says this, he cries out, he prays one more time. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he breathed his last. It says that Jesus called out with a loud voice. And I don't want you, you can't miss the sub-themes that are in here. He still calls out to God as a father who can be trusted. And in the middle of all the insults, in the middle of all the pain, in the middle of all the agony, he still cries out to God, "Father who could have stopped this, Father who could have kept me from suffering, Father who sees me suffering and could have spared me, Father who I decide to trust anyway. Into your hand I commit my spirit." And he breathed. And I'm not sure who in here today this lesson is for, but man, I see it so clearly now, and I hope you do too. I don't know, got some great, neat way to wrap this one up, other than to say that Jesus had, in spite of life, faith in God. And that paves the way for you and I to have, in spite of life, faith in God. And so we're going to end things a little bit differently today. I'm going to invite the band to come up here. They're going to come up here right now, and they're going to lead us in singing one more song. Maybe while they sing the song, okay, when we're done, I'm going to invite you to stand and sing with them. But maybe you just need to think and kind of sit in this story and what we talked about this morning. And the question that I want you to think about, right? And perhaps you've never really thought about it in terms like this before. Have you confused life with God? Have you perhaps drawn conclusions about God based on your experience in life? And what I want you to see, because of this story that we have and our bad boy of Easter, the criminal on the cross, we find out that God can be trusted in spite of what you experience. That God can be trusted in spite of what you experience. And here's the thing, right? I know that there's a good story. In fact, if we gave you the opportunity, it is only natural for us to say, to confuse those two, to take life and God, and when life is good, God is good. It's only natural for us to do that. I look at some of my closest friends right now who have dedicated their entire lives to serving and loving Jesus, and it's just like thing after thing after thing, and I get tired of praying and holding out the hope for them. And so, but yet they continue to hold on to hope, and they point to Jesus. And if you are in that same situation, I can tell you, we can see from the story of Jesus that Jesus paves the way by having, in spite of life, faith in God. And if we gave you the opportunity to come up here and to share your story, I'm sure that we would find ourselves, as we listen to you share your story, say, of course you gave up on God. Of course you got tired of praying. Of course you stopped going to church many, many years ago. But here's Jesus' message to us from the cross, as if to say, if you forget everything else, God is not what you have experienced. And perhaps, maybe your experience just happens to point to the very need for God to send his Son and begin to set right all the things that went wrong when we sinned. God is not what happens in your life. God sent Jesus to bring you life. Life happens, but God can be trusted. I'm going to pray.